Again, welcome to week 7 of American Government. In this chapter, we're going to talk about political participation, specifically the election process. Elections, of course, are very important. They're really the basis of a democracy. That's just how we measure the will of the people, and the people get to decide what destiny they want for their country by selecting the people that are going to represent them and run the government. The essence, of course, of a democratic government is giving the people a voice in the government, and we do that by letting them go to a polling place and vote, and that's the most direct way in which the will of the people is expressed. We have a long tradition of elections in our Anglo-American culture. It goes clear back well before the American Revolution to England, where they would vote and send people to Parliament. Of course, not just everyone could vote. It was males of a certain age who owned a certain amount of property. Usually they had qualifications, but way back in merry old England, people got to vote and send representatives to Parliament. In fact, not having elected representatives in Parliament was one major gripe that the colonists had that led to the American Revolution, if you remember. And having been denied the ability to vote by the British, the Americans, once they had the revolution and started a new country, they were very protective of voting rights, and that tradition has continued to the present day. As a practical matter, even if it wasn't the right thing to do, having elections would be the smart thing to do because it's very healthy in a governmental system. It keeps the people involved in their government, lets them have a voice. And that lends legitimacy to government decisions because the people feel like that they're kind of in on it. We let them have their say. And so they're more willing to accept the decisions that their leaders make if they had a hand in choosing the leaders and helping make those decisions. So if the leaders make unpopular decisions, the people have to blame themselves on some level for picking a bad leader if they're unhappy. And so they kind of feel like, they're vested in the system. It's not just some outside force forcing, something on them. They had a hand in picking the people who made these decisions. And when they're invested in what the government is doing by selecting who leads the government, and that gives the government legitimacy. If the government leaders can say, well, we were chosen in a popular vote, most of the people wanted us to be their leaders, and that gives the governments a certain kind of legitimacy. It bolsters their authority. And so that's really good. Even if you're in government, you want to have that stamp of approval because that kind of gives you that legitimacy. People will listen to you because they know you belong there because you won the election. Also, elections create political stability and social stability in a country. In countries where people can't express their frustrations through elections, the only way they can make themselves heard is by other means, such as street protests and violence. And so a lot of times when we see a revolution happen in a country, it's because the people were oppressed for a long time. No one was listening to their voices, and they couldn't express themselves any other way besides throwing rocks or picking up a gun and shooting at something. And so if we give people elections, that is how they can express themselves. We don't need to resort to that. Historically, we've seen dictatorships start to lose their grip on power, and when that happens, there will be popular uprisings led by people whose voices had been silenced for a very long time. And suddenly they finally find a way to vent their frustrations through some kind of revolution. And you got to wonder if they had been allowed to express themselves through elections, would they have been able to let off enough steam that a civil disturbance like that could have been avoided? But sometimes governments will try to shut the people up and just tell them this is a government, you need to accept it, and not let them have a say. And when that happens, sometimes there are violent underpinnings that kind of come to the fore. People will start protesting and things get out of hand, and before you know it, dictators are lined up and shot, and there's some new government that takes power. So having elections is just healthy for society. It lets people not only participate, but also vent their frustrations, gives legitimacy to the government, does all kinds of really good things. In America, we hold elections at the local, state, and national levels. Basically all layers of government, elections are very important. At the state and local levels, the process is pretty straightforward for the most part. Candidates who want an office will usually run as a member of one of the two major political parties, Democrats and Republicans. They may compete first against other members of their own party in a primary election. And that's where voters decide which Democrat and which Republican they want to represent those parties in the general election. So we'll have one election where we will pick who is our favorite Democrat and who's our favorite Republican, and then in the general election we will choose, well, do we want the Democrat or the Republican to actually win the election and take that office. The general election pits the winners of the primaries against one another, and usually whoever gathers the most votes in the general election wins that office, and that would be a plurality. Most of the time, in most places, whichever candidate gets a plurality of the votes wins the election. In other words, they get more votes than everyone else. It doesn't have to be 50% plus one in most states. It just has to be more votes than any other candidate. And that's certainly true in Missouri. So a candidate doesn't have to get more than half the votes cast. So long as they get more votes than the other candidates, they can still win an election even with less than 50% of the votes cast. And so they may only have 40% of the vote, but if everyone else in the race has less than 40% of the vote, that candidate will still win. Unlike Missouri, some states do actually require a winning candidate to carry a simple majority of the votes cast. So not just a plurality, but 50% plus one. States that do that include Louisiana and Georgia. And because they have this requirement, the general election may actually be held in two different stages, not just one like we have. Let's say that in the first stage we have three candidates and the vote is split almost evenly. A gets 30%, B gets 32%, and C gets 38%. Well, in that situation, nobody has 50% plus one. C got the most votes, but we didn't get to that simple majority. So no one is declared the winner because we haven't gotten anyone with a simple majority yet. So instead of just declaring C the winner and moving on like Missouri would, these states would have what we call a runoff election. So they'll go, there'll be a few weeks usually between the first stage and the second stage runoff, but voters will go back to the polls and vote for the top two vote getters. And so in this case, because A came in third, he'll drop off and we'll just have B versus C in the runoff election. And then usually, unless it comes to a complete tie, one of those is going to get 50% plus one, and with just those two choices on the ballot. So in a race with two candidates, unless there is that 50-50 tie, which almost never happens, once in a while it does, then we may have a coin flip depending on state law. But in a case with two candidates, usually we'll break that simple majority barrier, and then whoever wins that we will declare the winner of the race. And so in states that do require that simple majority, the general election is actually a two-step process sometimes. We usually think of elections as being used to choose candidates for some political office, but sometimes we'll also ask voters to approve a new law. And this often happens on the local level and sometimes at the state level as well. At the local level, we'll see this a lot of times around the area when a local school district wants to raise property taxes to pay for, say, a new high school or some other building project. And to do that, they'll have to go to the voters and ask the voters to impose a higher tax rate on themselves, basically. Usually a bond issue is the way that they do that. And so they'll ask the voters to vote yes or no. Should we raise our taxes to pay for some new school, or should we not? And a little note here, side note, in Missouri, when you see those ballot issues, they must pass by a supermajority, or 4/7, which I don't know how that works out in decimal equivalents, but it's more than 50%. And so that will give extra protection to property owners by making it harder to raise taxes, and so Missouri does that with a supermajority. But anyway, that's just one example of how we might actually go vote in an election on some kind of legal issue rather than just a candidate, what our tax rate should be. At the state level, the state legislature will sometimes put an issue to the voters in what we call a referendum. Basically, they will have a proposed law and say, okay, citizens of Missouri, do you want this law, yes or no? And people will get to vote on it. And we'll also do constitutional amendments that way sometimes as well. We'll put them on the ballot for voter approval. And we'll talk more about that when we cover Missouri government a little bit down the road. But this happens sometimes, not at the national level, but at the state or local levels. We'll have a referendum on some legal issue. It's kind of along the same line. Sometimes issues will get on the ballot because of the initiative process. And again, we will cover that when we talk about Missouri's constitution and legal system and all that a little bit later. But many states, including Missouri, have a procedure where voters in the state can circulate a petition and get a measure placed on the ballot. And so maybe a situation where people at large and the general public would like to see a law, but for whatever reason the legislature won't pass a bill on that, so they can bypass the legislature and the governor and everybody else and circulate a petition saying we want this constitutional amendment or a particular law on the ballot, and they can force that to appear there. And if the voters approve it, then it becomes law, even though it didn't go through the legislature like a normal bill would. And so sometimes in Missouri you'll see constitutional amendments and referendum questions and things like that on your ballot when you go to vote. If voters do approve an initiative petition in an election, it will become law, bypasses both the legislative and the executive branches, interestingly enough. And again, we'll talk more about referendums and the initiative process when we discuss Missouri's government a little bit down the road. Another type of election we need to look at briefly is what we call a recall election. And these are very rare, but once in a while, a person who wins election to public office makes the public so angry at them after they are elected that the public wants to remove them and kick them out of office. And that's what a recall election is for. And this is possible in many states, including Missouri, through a recall process. And again, this doesn't happen very often at all. But let's say that some public official, the governor or secretary of state or somebody, has made the voters so angry that they want to kick him out of office before their term is up. They can start a petition asking for a recall election for this official. If they collect enough signatures, they will get a question on the next election ballot that says, do you want to remove so-and-so from office? And if the voters say yes, then that person gets kicked out of office. So again, it's rare that politicians will make someone that angry that they're willing to circulate a petition and go through with this process, but it has happened. Most famously in recent history was in California in 2003, and there was a guy named Gray Davis who was the governor of California, and he was very unpopular. People just did not like the guy. And so what they did was they circulated that petition, got a question on the ballot, do you want to kick Gray Davis out of office? And more people voted yes than no, and so he was immediately removed from office. And on that same ballot paper, it said, well, who do you want as a replacement governor? And they chose Arnold Schwarzenegger, the actor. And so he got to be governor of California for a few years. And so, again, it's rare, but it does happen once in a while. So far, what we've been talking about is just elections in general, principles that are true at the state, local, or national levels. The rest of our time together in this unit will be spent talking about the election of the President of the United States, and by extension, the Vice President. This is a long and complicated process, I'm not going to lie. It's probably the most confusing thing that we will cover in the course, and so I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on it. And if it makes you scratch your head a little bit, that's perfectly normal. Just stick with me, and we will try to explain it the best we can as we go through here. So, when we're talking about elections at the state and local level, that's pretty straightforward, but not at the national level. And there are only two offices that we fill by means of a nationwide election, and that's the President and Vice President of the United States. And the procedure by which we elect them is weird, counterintuitive, and very long and drawn out. And so we're going to spend some time looking at that. Most people on the street are probably unaware of this process. They think that, when there's a presidential election, they go to the polls and vote. Whoever gets the most votes wins. But it's not nearly that simple. It's much more complicated than that. Remember, we talked about this back when we discussed the Constitutional Convention long ago. And if you remember there, the delegates had a hard time figuring out how to elect the president. And they finally settled upon letting people elect representatives called electors who would meet together in an organization called the Electoral College and choose the president. And that is still how it works today. It works a little differently than the Founding Fathers envisioned, but it still works. The Electoral College is still with us. And so when people go vote for president, what they're actually doing is voting for a slate of electors to the Electoral College. But that's really just one step in the process and very near the end. And so we're going to kind of take it from the beginning and look at, in the presidential election cycle, how we kind of get from the start to the finish line where we actually end up with a president. We start off with the primary elections. And in the modern world, it seems like people start thinking about the next presidential election as soon as the last one has finished. And that's not too far from the truth, because it takes so much time to raise the money, gather the support, and get prepared for a campaign, because it's so long and it's so expensive that you almost have to start a couple years early. And so serious candidates for the presidency usually have to do some serious planning really early on. And part of that's because of the vast sums of money that they need in order to be competitive in these races. They'll have to travel all over the country. They'll have to hire some really smart people, conduct a lot of opinion polls and things that cost money, and do a lot of advertising. And so all of that takes money, and raising money is hard work. And so it'll take a while for them to get to the point where they can afford the whole race for president. Again, TV advertising, travel expenses, hiring a staff comes into play. And to make it more complicated, there are campaign finance limits imposed by Congress on how much candidates can raise money from one person or one company. There are limits to how much you can contribute to a particular candidate. And so recently, the internet has kind of come into play as a powerful tool for fundraising, because it allows you the ability to collect lots and lots of small donations, even just $5 or $10 from millions of people, rather than a few big donations like they used to be able to do in the past. And so there is some regulation on that actually makes it a little more difficult. But early on, candidates have to begin building a network of supporters and asking them for money long before anyone casts a ballot. So they have to do a lot of prep work before we get to the actual election cycle itself. And the presidential election kind of seems to begin up to 2 years or so before the actual election. And so people will be campaigning and trying to gather support a long time before anyone actually casts a vote. The presidential election occurs in 2 stages, the primary elections and the general election. We already looked at that a little bit, but basically, in the primary stages, we're trying to figure out who we want to represent the Democratic Party and who we want to represent the Republican Party. And normally there will be more than one candidate for both sides, unless we have a sitting president who's running for re-election usually. And the primary election process by itself gets pretty convoluted sometimes. A presidential election is held every 4 years. A president's term in office begins in January. So as I make this video, it's late 2015. And 2016 is the election year. We will vote for president in November 2016. That person, whoever is elected, will take office in January of 2017. Well, the general election is held in November of 2016, but here I am in late 2015, and we are still in the middle of a presidential election cycle. There are a lot of candidates running. They're having debates and things. So the race lasts a long time, over a year prior to the actual election, maybe closer to 2. And so, for instance, the 2008 election, the first primary elections were held in January. The candidate who won the general election took office in January of 2009. It'll work that way again. Every election cycle kind of has that sort of timetable to it. And so we have about a full year of election campaigns before we know who the winner is going to be and all the votes are counted and all that. So it's just a really long, drawn-out process. The primary elections themselves begin in January of the election year. So in the election year 2008, the primaries began in January of 2008, and in 2016 it'll be January of 2016. And they'll continue up through the summer, usually ending in June, and different states will hold them at different times. And so they'll stretch along for a while. And we're really not talking about one primary election. We're talking about 100 different primary elections, because each state will hold some kind of Democratic primary and a Republican primary. So we have 50 states and 2 different parties. And so multiply those together, you end up with 100 different contests. As we'll see, some will be caucuses and some will be actual primary elections. But somehow or another, each state has to weigh in on which Republican and which Democrat they want to be running for president. And those don't happen at the same time. They're stretched over several months there. And the party will decide at the state level when it wants to hold its primary. And in some states, a Democratic primary is held on one date and a Republican primary is held on another. So it gets really complicated sometimes trying to figure all that out. But again, we don't have one primary contest. We have 100 different ones And any one candidate will be competing in 50 of those because they'll want to win every state if they can and be the nominee of their party. A recent trend is for states to try to move their primary elections earlier and earlier in the year. The reason for that is they feel that the earlier they get a chance to hold a primary, the more influence they'll have on the eventual outcome of the election. The reason for that is that the candidates who win those earliest primaries are viewed as the front runner. And we've talked about the bandwagon effect in public opinion. Well, when somebody wins some of those early primaries, they're seen as a front runner. People see them and think, that's going to be the winner. And so people are more likely to support them. So the more success they have, the more people they attract. And so it kind of snowballs. And so people really pay attention to those earliest primaries because they're really, really influential and because they give candidates a chance to shine early and gather a lot of support. So the candidates who claim victory in those earliest primaries, they start to outdistance the competition usually, and they will build support as the front runner. And so although the primary process continues well into the summer, the eventual winners of both parties' nominations are usually known, often anyway, as early as February, maybe March. So the states that hold their primaries after that in May or June may not have any effect on the actual outcome of choosing who the nominee of each party is going to be. And so states don't like to be irrelevant and hold an election for no reason, and so they'll want to move it a little earlier if they can. So some states recently have tried to move their primaries earlier up on the calendar so they feel like they have more of a voice in the process. And that's been met with some resistance, both by states that have always held their primaries early and by the parties themselves who don't want everything bunched up like that. And traditionally, the New Hampshire primary is always held first. Don't know why really, but it's a little bitty state. And then New England, but they want to have the first say. And so that's traditionally where the first primary is held. And then Iowa caucuses come shortly after that. And so after that, the other states really start having primaries thick and fast, and we start trying to figure out who the nominee is going to be. Primary elections are either open or closed. In an open primary state like Missouri, you can show up at the polling place and just the election official asks, well, do you want to vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary? And you just tell them which ballot you want. You can't vote in both, but you can pick whichever one you want at any time, which is kind of interesting in a way. So if you ask for a Democrat ballot, then no one asks you to prove you're a Democrat. They just give it to you. So that means that anyone who wants to can vote in either party's primary, whether they're officially a member of that party or not. So a voter can vote in one primary in one election, the other primary in the next election. That's perfectly all right. If you want to vote in the Republican primary in one election, the Democratic primary in the next, no one's going to stop you. Perfectly legal, perfectly fine. And that's an open primary system. In a state with a closed primary, you have to officially declare your allegiance to one party or the other, a specified time before the primary election before you're allowed to vote in that party's primary. So in order to vote in the Democratic primary, you'd have to register as an official Democrat with your county office, like 30 days before the election or something like that. And so some states do that, and they try to make sure that it's really just members of that party that vote in that party's primary. But states like Missouri just let anyone and everyone, whoever asks to, vote in a party's primary. So if you have a closed system, that tends to keep voters from crossing over and voting in the primary of a party they don't have any allegiance to. And you can kind of see the advantage of that because, theoretically anyway, if there's a Democratic primary, a bunch of sneaky Republicans could go vote in the Democratic primary and all vote for the weakest candidate they think would be the easiest one to beat. And so that would be unfair to the Democrats, or, it might happen the other way as well. So a closed primary system tries to prevent that. An open primary state like Missouri just doesn't care. So if you vote in Missouri, you can vote in either primary, whichever one you want to. Instead of a primary election, a state party can instead choose to hold a caucus. And a caucus is a little bit different than a primary election, but it basically does the same job. The way this works, members of the party will gather in one place in each voting district. And it could be a public place or it could just be somebody's living room. It just really depends on the district and how big it is and so on and so forth. Once there, they will discuss the various candidates, and then at some point they'll say, okay, everybody, who do you support? And they will divide themselves up into different groups, one for each candidate. And so that's a way of seeing which candidate has the largest amount of support. And so it's kind of like a primary, but like I said, a little bit different. And the way that a caucus is conducted varies depending on the state and the party, but it still serves the same purpose. They choose which candidate has a certain amount of support at the National Nominating Convention, which we'll discuss in a little bit. Iowa famously has a caucus right after the New Hampshire primary usually, and so it's kind of the second big contest that candidates go through on their way through the presidential election cycle. The purpose of either a primary or a caucus is to determine how many delegates each candidate will have supporting him or her at the party's convention. And both parties, Republicans and Democrats, will hold a national convention after all the primaries are over. So they'll pick a city somewhere, and all the delegates from all 50 states will show up at this convention to choose who that party's nominee is going to be. So they will write the party's platform, but they will also officially determine which candidate they want to represent the party in the general election that November. The way this works, the delegates, and that's just representatives from each state who attend that convention, the delegates to the convention will cast their votes, and the candidate with the majority of delegate support will win that party's nomination. Decades ago, these national conventions of the parties really determined who was going to represent the party in the general election. And going into the convention, we didn't know who they were going to pick. In the era before we had direct primary elections like we do today, it wouldn't depend upon what the people wanted or who they voted for. These delegates would just show up to the convention and pick whoever they wanted. And so the popular vote had no bearing on it at all. And that's how it worked long ago. And because of that, there were lots and lots of shady backroom deals among delegates trying to figure out which candidate they were going to support in exchange for different favors. But conventions are no longer like that at all. The delegates to the convention are chosen based upon the results of the popular vote in the primary elections and the caucuses. And we'll look and see how that works here in a second. All right, so we vote in a primary election, but the nominee from that party for president is actually chosen at the party convention. How do those two things kind of line up together? Well, what happens when we vote in a primary, we'll vote for a name on the ballot. We want Joe Smith to be president. But what we're really doing is voting for that candidate's slate of delegates in our state who we want to attend that party's convention. And so Joe Smith will have a slate of delegates. Let's say Missouri sends 50 delegates to the national convention for the Democratic Party, and Joe Smith is running for president as a Democrat. When we vote for Joe Smith in the Democratic primary, we're voting for Joe Smith's delegates, that we want them to be the ones who attend the party convention that summer. If we vote for Susie instead, we'll be voting for Susie's 50 delegates. And so we're really voting for how many seats at the convention that candidate's delegates will have. So it's kind of interesting where each candidate has that slate of candidates committed to voting for him or her. And so Joe Smith will have picked out candidates that he wants to represent him from Missouri, and Susie will have a slate of candidates. So he'll have picked out 50 people who she wants to go represent Missouri at the convention who support her. And so when we vote in that primary, we're really voting for that candidate's slate of delegates. So let's look at an example. Let's say we have the Missouri Republican primary, and you have two candidates, A and B. A wins 47% of the vote, and B wins 53%. So B has won the election. Okay, well, what does that actually mean in terms of how it works at the national convention for the Republican Party that summer? Well, let's say that Missouri is allowed to send 50 delegates to the Republican National Convention who will select the actual nominee for the Republican Party for president. Well, some Republican parties' primaries are winner-take-all. Some aren't, but we'll talk about that difference in a minute. But for the moment, let's assume that it's winner-take-all. So if that's the case, B's slate of 50 delegates here will be the ones representing Missouri at the Republican Convention. Okay, so Missouri's going to send 50 people to the Republican Convention. The primary is all about determining which 50 delegates actually get sent. The 50 delegates who support A or the 50 delegates who support candidate B. And in this case, since candidate B won the primary election, all 50 people who Missouri sends to the Republican National Convention will be supporters of candidate B. And so when that convention takes a vote and says, well, who do we want to nominate to be the Republican candidate for president? All the 50 Missouri people will vote for B. And so that's what we're really doing in a primary election, is picking out the delegates. And so when that vote is held at the convention, those delegates, we say, are pledged to vote for candidate B. So they're going to cast their votes in favor of B. Okay? And so basically, what this means is that when the primary season is over and we actually are going to hold that national convention, it's usually not a mystery anymore who the delegates of that convention are going to vote for, because the primary elections are all about choosing which delegates we send to those national party conventions. Are we going to send the candidates or the delegates that support this candidate or that candidate? And so if we tally up all the results from the primary elections and that have occurred up to that point, we will know before the convention even starts who those delegates are going to vote for, because they are pledged for one candidate or another. And so we will know who that convention is going to nominate for president before they ever take a vote at the convention, which is kind of strange. But we go through that primary process just to figure out which candidates' delegates our state is going to send to that national party convention. Well, Democratic primaries tend to be a little bit different than the example we just looked at, because they're not winner-take-all. And now some Republican ones aren't either. So this makes it even a little bit more confusing, to be honest with you. So kind of unfortunate that they did that, speaking as the person who has to try to explain this to you. But instead of that, they'll use proportional representation. And we looked at how that works earlier on in a previous chapter. But they will use this proportional representation to split up the number of delegates from every state. So let's look at an example of that. Let's say that California is going to send 100 Democratic delegates to the Democratic National Convention. And you have two candidates in the California primary, X and Y. Okay. Well, X gets 40% of the vote and Y gets 60%. Well, Y has won the election, and if this was a winner-take-all, they would get all 100 delegates. But that's not what happens, because the Democrats always want to be a little more fair than that, and so even to the losing candidate, they'll get a certain percentage of the vote. So in this example, they might award 40 of the 100 delegates to X because he got 40% of the vote, and then the 60 delegates to Y for getting 60% of the vote. And so instead of all the delegates being in support of one candidate, we might split them up based upon how well they actually did in the primary election. And with the winner-take-all system, that kind of helps us in some ways determine a winner more earlier in the process. And because candidates who can't win a primary often drop out quickly because they're just not gathering any support. They won't have any delegates at the convention at all unless they can win a primary somewhere. And so the front runner sometimes can kind of run away with it early, because if they win the primaries, if they keep coming in first, they're going to starve out all the other candidates, and where they're not gathering any delegates at all. And so they can see the writing on the wall pretty early and figure out they're never going to get enough delegates at the convention to become the nominee of the party. And so that may cause them to drop out a little bit earlier. Sometimes this proportional representation thing can actually drag things out a little bit, and Democrats got into trouble with this a little bit in 2008, and they ended up winning the general election. Obama got elected, and he's a Democrat. But getting to that point where Obama became the nominee was a long, drawn-out, and ugly process, because Obama and Hillary Clinton were slugging it out, and they were about neck and neck, about 50-50. And so they kept having all these primary elections and caucuses to where they would kind of split the votes evenly, and so the delegates were split evenly as well. And so by the time we got into like May and June, it was still unclear who the nominee was going to be. And so the proportional system, because it kept rewarding the candidate who came in second, it didn't propel the front runner as far ahead as if it had been a winner-take-all system. And so it ended up kind of dragging out the primary process longer than it usually goes. And it took a while for Obama to kind of pull away from Hillary and kind of set himself apart and make it clear that he was going to become the nominee. And so that took a while. Well, at some point during the primary season, it's going to become obvious who the nominee is going to be, because they'll have lined up enough delegates from enough different primary elections to assure themselves of having the most delegates at the convention. And so it's going to become obvious before we ever get to the convention who the nominee is going to be in the modern world, at least. And at that point, a candidate will at some point choose a running mate. And that is the person who's going to run for vice president. And so The main candidate will be running for president and will choose a running mate to be the party's nominee for vice president. The candidate and his running mate will campaign as a team, and voters will see their names together on the ballot, and so they will vote for them as a pair. So voters in the general election will actually end up voting for a pair of people. On the ballot, they'll have two main choices: the Republican candidate and his running mate, and the Democratic candidate and his or her running mate. And so you'll be voting for a pair, one or the other. Voting for president and vice president together means that they will like each other enough to do the country's business effectively, because they're on the same page, they're from the same team, the same party, so hopefully they will get along fairly well. Remember, early on in the country's history, whoever came in second running for president became vice president, and we had a very bad experience with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson coming in 1 and 2 respectively, and they didn't like each other, so we adjusted that to where now they run as a team. Well, in the primary season, at some point, it'll become clear that a candidate has won over half of the delegates who are going to show up and vote at the convention. And so we will know before the convention actually starts who the nominee is going to be. That means that when we actually take a vote at the convention of all the delegates and ask them, well, who do you want to be the nominee? We'll already know what the result's going to be, because we will know how many delegates to the convention are pledged for each candidate based upon the primary election and caucus results. And so that kind of makes that vote just a formality, really. So that being said, why do we even mess with having a convention, since we already know what the result's going to be and who the nominee of the party will be? Well, certainly the delegates at the convention write the party platform, which is important. They'll put in writing the party's policies and all that stuff that we talked about earlier. The real purpose, though, of a convention in this modern world is it's a week-long infomercial for the party and their candidate. And so they will get just a ton of network news coverage of the convention every night. Usually all 3 networks will show the convention and all the speeches and things that are given and that kind of thing. And it's a powerful way for the party to get its message out to voters. Like I said, it's basically an infomercial, the whole thing. And so they'll get all this free TV coverage and be able to really, say how wonderful their candidate is and why you should vote for them, and try to get support all stirred up for their candidate. And so they just love that free airtime, and so they'll have a convention if for no other reason than to get their message across by free TV coverage. Now we're going to move to the general election and the Electoral College and how that process works. Once both parties have had their conventions and nominated a candidate, then the 2 parties' nominees will go head-to-head in the general election. And so we'll have picked a Democratic candidate and a Republican candidate. And those were, we may start out with 20 candidates, many from both parties. But by the time we get past the party conventions, we'll have picked the nominee for each party, and it'll just be 1 Republican versus 1 Democrat going toward the general election. The party conventions are usually held in the late summertime, July or even August, and then the election itself, the general election, is held in November. And on election day, millions of Americans will go to the polls and vote for who they want to be their next president. And when they look at the ballot, they will see the names of the candidates and their running mates, and they will mark their preference for which of those candidates they want. However, they don't realize this usually, but they are not actually voting for the candidates themselves. Instead, they are voting for electors who will be part of the Electoral College. And it's those electors who will actually cast the votes which decide the election. So let's see how that works. Remember that our founding fathers who wrote the Constitution were in fact a little bit elitist. And they were unwilling to leave an important decision like choosing the president in the hands of the ignorant and uneducated American people. They didn't think the American people were bad people. They just didn't think they were, literate and educated and enough really to make that kind of decision on their own. And so there was a big discussion about how to handle that. Remember that they figured out they would follow a Republican model where the people would choose representatives who would in turn choose the president. And we still follow that system today. Many people don't realize that. They think that when they vote in a presidential election, they're just voting for that candidate. But it's a little more complicated than that. Instead, they are voting for that candidate's slate of electors. And we just looked at that in the primary elections. How when you vote for a candidate in a primary, you're not really voting for that candidate, you're voting for their slate of delegates to the National Party Convention. in a very similar way. When you vote in the general election for a presidential candidate, you're really voting for that candidate's electors. And so we'll look and see how that works. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the election itself, let's talk about how the votes in the Electoral College are kind of divided up between the different states. Each state is given a certain number of electoral votes, which means how many people it contributes to the Electoral College, depending on that state's population. The more population a state has, the more votes it gets in the Electoral College, and so the more voice it has in determining who the president is going to be. Each state is given one vote in the Electoral College for each senator it has in Congress, and one vote for each representative in the House. And remember, each state has 2 senators, and each state has at least 1 representative, usually more than that, depending on how much population the state has. And so each state's going to have at least 3 electoral votes. And the number of House seats a state has is determined by that state's population. And so, by extension, then the number of electoral votes a state has is also determined by population. The more people that live in a state, the more votes it'll have in the Electoral College, the more say that state will have in determining who the president is going to be. And again, since each state has 2 senators and at least 1 rep, each state gets at least 3 electoral votes in the Electoral College. If you look at the way electoral votes are divided up right now, as I make this, and it's in late 2015, Missouri has 2 senators, which is always going to be true, and right now we have 8 representatives. We used to actually have 9 representatives until the last census in 2010, and we ended up losing a House seat. So now we're down to 10 electoral votes. So we have 2 senators, 8 House of Representatives members for a total of 10 electoral votes. By comparison, California, which is the most populous state in the United States, has 2 senators and 53 seats in the House of Representatives, which means that California has 55 electoral votes, so 5.5 times more say in the outcome of the presidential election than Missouri has. And so you can see how much population really matters, okay? Well, let's look at Wyoming, which is the least populous state in the United States. They also have 2 senators, just like everyone else, and only 1 representative, so they only get 3 electoral votes. And so look at the difference between California and Wyoming. It's huge. Wyoming only gets 3 electoral votes, California gets 55. And so the more population your state has, the more impact that state will have when we have a presidential election, because the more electoral votes it will have to contribute toward the outcome of that election. Looking at the Electoral College as a whole, there are 535 senators and congressmen. We know there's 435 congressmen, 100 senators. You add the 2 together, you get 535. So you would think that we would have a total of 535 electoral votes in the Electoral College. Not quite correct, however, because of Washington, D.C. The District of Columbia is not a state, and as such, it does not have representation in Congress. It does not have any senators, and it does not have a representative in the House of Representatives. But thanks to the 23rd Amendment, it ends up getting the same number of electoral votes it would have if it were a state. And so if it were a state, it would have 2 senators and 1 seat in the House of Representatives. And so that's the amount of electoral votes we give it, is 3. And so if you look at the total Electoral College, we have 100 senators, 435 representatives total in Congress, plus 3 extra votes for D.C. And so that gives us 538 electoral votes in total. And that's how that is the total makeup of the Electoral College when you look at the whole thing. So although millions of Americans go to the polls to vote for who they want to be president, it's actually the votes of these 538 electors who determine who actually wins the presidential election. As we will see, who the electors vote for is directly determined by who those millions of Americans vote for. And so it's not like their votes don't count, not at all. I can't stress that enough. But we kind of put those millions of votes from ordinary Americans into this formula and through the Electoral College, and it kind of churns a little bit and spits out a total number of electoral votes, and that's how we actually determine who has won the election. So hopefully that'll become clear as we go along. Maybe it won't, so I apologize in advance, but try to hang with me. Well, we have all these 538 electors whose job it is to choose the president. And what the Founding Fathers thought was that the people would vote for electors. They would know who those electors were going to be by name, and they would vote for the smartest, wisest people they knew, and we would trust them to go vote for the president and choose our president for us. Well, That's not how it works today. The electors aren't expected to use their independent judgment. That is no longer the case. The Electoral College is supposed to reflect directly the will of the people. So even though we still have the Electoral College, it doesn't operate like the Founding Fathers thought it would, because we put more emphasis nowadays on the will of the people. And so we want the Electoral College to really reflect the popular vote, what the people are voting for. It has a direct impact on who the Electoral College votes for. They don't use their independent judgment. What happens is in every state, there are going to be two potential slates of electors, one Democrat and one Republican. And so sitting out there prior to the general election in November, the state of Missouri will have figured out, the state Democratic Party will pick out 10 people to be electors from Missouri, and the Republican Party will pick out 10 electors to be electors from Missouri. And so we have 10 Democrats waiting to be electors and 10 Republicans waiting to be electors. And so what will happen is if the Democratic candidate attracts the most votes in Missouri, say, then Missouri will send those 10 Democrats to go vote in the Electoral College. On the other hand, if the Republican is the one who attracts the most votes in the popular vote, when the people go to the polls and cast their ballot for president, well, then we will send the 10 Republicans to the Electoral College to vote as our electors. And so the voters are actually choosing which slate of electors they want. Do they want the Democratic slate of electors or the Republican slate of electors? And so that's actually what we're choosing when we are voting in the popular vote. So again, in Missouri, there's 10 potential Democratic electors sitting out there and 10 potential Republican electors waiting in the wings, waiting to see if their candidate wins the popular vote. So if more voters choose the Republican candidate, then his 10 electors will be the ones to vote in the Electoral College. And he will get all 10 of Missouri's electoral votes. And it's a winner-take-all system. So it doesn't matter what the margin of victory is. If the Republican candidate wins by 1 vote or 1,000,000 votes, they're still going to get all 10 of those electors. Doesn't work like that in all states, as we will see in just a second. But in Missouri, that is how it works. And so when people go to the polls in November to vote for president, they will cast a ballot for a particular name. This is the guy I want to be president, or this is a woman I want to be president. But what they're actually doing is choosing between 2 competing slates of electors who will vote in the Electoral College and represent Missouri. And we have 10 people who want to be electors who are pledged to vote for the Democratic candidate, and 10 people who want to be electors who are pledged to vote for the Republican candidate. And so the voters of Missouri are choosing which group of electors they want to represent their state when they're voting. They may not realize it, but that's exactly what they're doing. Well, that asterisk I had there means that not every state works exactly like Missouri. In a couple of states, they choose their electors a little bit differently. It's a winner-take-all system in most states, but states actually have the power to determine on their own how their electoral votes will be awarded. And so a state could pick out a new method rather than winner-take-all if they want to, and a couple of states have done that. They have a slightly different method for awarding their electoral votes. In Nebraska and Maine, instead of just using the winner-take-all, they will award electoral votes on the basis of which candidate wins the most popular votes in a congressional district. And so they will look at a particular congressional district, and whoever wins the majority of votes in that district may end up with one of Nebraska's electoral votes. And so a candidate can actually do well in part of the state and not the rest of the state, and still get at least one electoral vote from that state. So they will actually, Nebraska and Maine will split their electoral votes between 2 candidates potentially. So that's kind of weird, but that's definitely the outlier position. Most of the time it's winner take all. And so whichever candidate wins the most popular votes in a state is going to get all of that state's electoral votes. And so that's how the majority of states do it. So when people go to the polls to vote in a presidential election, they'll be voting for a candidate's name, but what they're actually doing is not voting directly for that candidate. They're voting for that candidate's group of electors who will cast the electoral votes who will actually decide who the president is. Do we want the Democratic ones or the Republican ones? Well, if they cast a vote for the Republican candidate, that's really a vote for the Republican slate of electors from Missouri, say, or whatever state they happen to be in. So if we vote for the Republican candidate, we're really saying we want the Republican electors to vote for president from our state. In order to win the presidential election, a winning candidate must get a simple majority of the electoral votes. Remember, there's 538 total, so they have to get at least 270 of the 538 in order to win the election and become president. The people go to the polls and vote in November, and it's the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November. It's been that way for a really long time, and we've been doing that every 4 years since 1778. But the real election, quote unquote, occurs when the electors who were chosen by the popular vote on that Tuesday in November gathered together a couple of weeks later and cast the electoral votes. And so in every state, the slate of electors that's chosen by the voters will gather together in the state capitol and cast their electoral votes. And so the people will go to the polls, on a Tuesday in early November, pick which slate of electors they want, and then whichever slate they get, the Republican electors or the Democratic electors, they will gather in the state capitol and formally cast their electoral votes. And so that's really the election that decides the president as the electors. But the electors were chosen by the people. So who the electors vote for is directly impacted. It's determined by the popular vote, whoever the people voted for. The two slates of electors in every state are chosen by the state party leaders in advance of the actual election itself. The people who are chosen to be electors are extremely partisan. And so we know the Democratic electors are going to vote for the Democrat, the Republican electors are going to vote for the Republican, usually without any question at all. And that means the electors are pledged, which means that they have promised to vote for that party's candidate if he wins the popular vote in the state, and they are then given the opportunity to vote as electors. And so they pretty much promised, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, and I'm going to vote for the Democratic candidate if I'm selected as an elector. Okay, and so that's how that works. However, legally, there's nothing to enforce that promise, even though they promised to vote for that candidate. So if they decided to vote for someone else, they can. There's no penalty for that. But it doesn't happen very often. When we do have that happen, where an elector kind of goes astray and votes for someone that they're not supposed to, that person is known as a faithless elector. And so they may do that for reasons of protest or something. Sometimes they'll just, I don't know, something will get into them. A lot of times they're old people, actually, and once in a while one will get confused. But sometimes they'll just try to make a statement. And if their candidate lost anyway, they'll vote for somebody else just to kind of as a protest vote or something. But it doesn't happen very often at all. The electors, when they gather together, are given two ballots, one for president, one for vice president. They actually have to write in the name of the person that they select. So they don't have a little bubble they fill in like you and I do when we go vote for president. They'll actually have to write the name on the piece of paper. Like I said, sometimes electors get confused. One did after the 2004 election. Actually wrote in the name of the presidential candidate on the vice presidential ballot and the vice presidential candidate's name on the presidential ballot to reverse the two. So there's really nothing to prevent that if they do something silly. But that, like I said, that happens very, very rarely. Faithless electors don't normally happen at all. So, as a consequence, the Electoral College as it is used today, not like the Founding Fathers intended it, really, but as it is used today, is actually a very good reflection of the popular vote. And most of the time, the candidate who wins the popular vote will also win the vote in the Electoral College and become president. Not always, but most of the time that is the case. And so your vote does count. We just put our popular vote into this big machine called the Electoral College, and it'll spit out a result. But most of the time, the candidate who wins that popular vote is also going to win the Electoral College vote and actually become president. Well, after the electors get together, the electoral votes will be collected and sent to Washington, D.C. In early January, Congress will then meet in a joint session, which means the Senate and House come together and meet in one room, and they will count the electoral votes from all over the country. If one candidate receives at least 270 of those electoral votes, he is declared the winner, and the election is over. Most people think, of course, it's over when they cast their votes in November, but really the process isn't over until January, after the Electoral College has voted and after Congress has counted those votes. The candidates who win the election will be sworn into office in late January in an event known as the inauguration, where the outgoing president, if there is one, will give a speech, and then the incoming president will give a speech, and everyone will give speeches, and there will be songs and lots of clapping and that kind of stuff. And so then that whoever won the presidential election will actually become president at the inauguration. If you were thinking mathematically, when we say that there are 538 electoral college votes, you may have noticed that's an even number, which means it divides evenly into two. It's possible to have a tie in the electoral college, 269 to 269. And if that's the case, neither candidate would have the simple majority that is required for them to become president. So what happens then? The Constitution has actually planned for that. If there is a tie, then the election gets thrown into Congress, and the House of Representatives gets to choose who the president will be. They get to pick among the top three candidates who got the most electoral college votes and get to choose which one of those people that they want. Each state will have one vote, so it doesn't matter how many representatives that state sends to Washington, each state will only get one vote. So there are 55, I think, from California, but there will only be one vote for California. And as a practical matter, what would happen is it just depends on which party ends up having more congressmen in each state. That would probably determine who that state votes for, because the congressmen, the Democrats would either outvote the Republicans or the Republicans would outvote the Democrats and choose who their state casts its vote for. But that's how it would work. Each state would get one vote in the House of Representatives. The winning candidate would have to get a simple majority of the votes from the states in Congress there, which means that they'd have to get the support of 26 or more out of the 50 states. The Senate, at the same time, would be selecting the vice president. Each senator would get an individual vote, which means there would be 100 votes total, and they'd get to choose between the top two candidates, and whoever ended up with 51 votes or more would become vice president. This has actually happened a couple of times. The election of 1800 was just a real complicated mess, actually, but it ended up being decided in the Congress, and Thomas Jefferson defeated Aaron Burr. And in 1824, it also went into Congress, and John Quincy Adams finally emerged as the victor after a whole lot of votes. They couldn't make up their minds for quite a while, but they finally figured out John Quincy Adams would be the president. So it hasn't happened in a really, really long time, getting close to 200 years, but it has happened. And if it were to happen, that's just what would take place. The Congress would end up choosing our president for us. There are some weird things about the Electoral College, as you might imagine, but it has some interesting effects on the election process sometimes. For one thing, the candidate who attracts the votes of most people nationwide, or we say will win the popular vote, may not actually end up winning the electoral vote. So the person who gets the most people voting for them may still not become president. It doesn't happen very often, but it can happen, and it has happened a couple of times. Most recently, in 2000, Al Gore actually won 500,000 more votes nationwide than George W. Bush, but he still lost in the Electoral College and didn't become president. How can that happen? Now, because we know that the Electoral College is a reflection of the popular vote. It just is. The electoral votes are decided by how people vote in the popular vote. So how can we have a situation where the two don't actually line up? Well, we will try to understand how this can happen. Bear with me. It's a little complicated, and it deals with math. So just stick with me. We'll see if we can figure this out. You have to remember, and the key to this is that the presidential election is not a true national election in the sense that all the votes from all the candidates nationwide are dumped into one hopper and we figure out who had the most votes. That's not how it works. Really, it's 50 separate state races for president, and so it's 50 different elections in each of the 50 states, or I guess 51 with the District of Columbia. So the nationwide total of popular votes does not determine the outcome. Instead, we look to see who wins each state. And so that is really how it is determined, because that's how we divvy up the electoral votes. So we have to see how a candidate did state by state in order to see who wins. As the candidates win a particular state, the electoral votes from that state will be added to their total on their way to 270. And when they get to that magic number of 270, then they win. But we have to look and see how they did in each state, not just nationally with the popular vote, in order to see how they did. Because of that, if you look at a national opinion poll in a presidential election, it's kind of meaningless because it doesn't matter how many people support a candidate. It depends on where they live. How many states are they going to win? So we have to know where their support is located, not just how much support nationwide. Because a candidate could win a bunch of states by a razor-thin margin, and the other candidate, wins a few big states by huge margins, and they would have more popular votes, but the candidate that wins the most states is going to be the one that actually pulls out a victory. So we have to know where the support actually is located in each state. The candidate has to get enough votes in enough states to win those states and capture their electoral votes in order to actually win the election. So if you look at a poll that's done nationwide and shows that 55% of the people like candidate A and 45% like candidate B, we really don't know who's ahead, because we have to know how the candidates are doing in all 50 states before we can really understand what their chances of winning are. Because, again, that candidate who looks like he's ahead may have a huge amount of support in a few states, but unless they can win more states and actually pile up those electoral votes, that popular support's not going to turn into electoral votes, and so they might still end up losing the race. So the candidate who wins the most votes in a state will usually get all of that state's electoral votes. It's usually winner take all, and it doesn't matter how small or large the margin of victory is. If a candidate wins by 0.001% of the vote, they're going to get all of that state's electoral votes. If they win by 10 million votes, they're still going to get all of that state's electoral votes. So in a sense, those extra popular votes, once they've won the state, any popular votes they get above that doesn't help them, because it doesn't turn into more electoral votes. And so that's one way that with the electoral vote can kind of be distorted from reflecting the popular vote, because the more people can vote for them, but it doesn't matter what your margin of victory is. It would be better for that candidate if they had those supporters living in some other state, so they could turn that state into a victory for them. Anyway, so as we said, if that candidate wins by 80% of the vote, or 0.008%, he still gets all that state's electoral votes, and so that extra level of support isn't really going to help him any. So all the candidate's really worried about in any particular state is getting more votes than the other guy. He doesn't care how many more votes because of that winner-take-all system. As long as he gets more votes, then he's going to be okay. So if he gets 50% plus 1, his victory in that state is assured. Any other votes he gets in that state, any popular votes, don't really help him because they can't turn into more electoral votes. Once he's already won all of them in that state, that extra support from these voters who voted for him, it doesn't really help him anymore once he's won outright. So once he's won the state, he's gotten all the electoral votes it has to offer. And in a sense, I hate to say it this way, but any additional popular votes that you get in that state are kind of wasted because they don't help you in the Electoral College. And that's where we determine the winner and the loser, is in the Electoral College. So if you get a huge amount of support, in a state, that's great. You'll probably win that state, but it'd be better off if some of those voters lived somewhere else, so you could have won a second state rather than just pile up all your support in that one state. And so the Electoral College really rewards people who have supporters all over the country, because the more states that you win, the bigger your electoral vote count will come to be. Remember that the states with the smallest populations are actually overrepresented in the House of Representatives. Because we guarantee every state's going to have at least one representative, even if we divided the population evenly by 435, if they shouldn't get an entire representative to themselves, we will still give them one. So every state is guaranteed to have at least one representative in the House of Representatives. Well, that actually translates into electoral votes, because it's the same in the Electoral College. So, I like to pick on Wyoming. It's the smallest state population-wise in the United States. And they will actually carry more weight in the Electoral College than they should, because if you divide the population of America by 435, that number is going to be bigger than the number of people that live in Wyoming. So if we actually divided things equally, Wyoming ought to have like half of an electoral vote instead of 3, but they still end up with 3 because every state gets 2 senators and at least 1 rep, so they're guaranteed 3, even if they, by population, they'd only deserve, say, 2 or something. And so smaller states can actually punch above their weight in the Electoral College. They actually get more representation in the Electoral College than their population would lead you to think that they ought to have based upon our rules that we have. So it's actually to a candidate's advantage to win lots of small states rather than a few big ones, because those small states, like we said, kind of, punch above their weight there. They're worth more electoral votes than their population would lead you to believe. And so it can actually be an advantage if a candidate has widespread support over lots and lots of states rather than piling that up in just a few big states. And so that can kind of reward you. And also, it encourages candidates to win those rural states because they will have a kind of a built-in advantage if they campaign in these states with a smaller population. So, say that we have candidate A, who does really well in a few big states, and candidate B, who wins a few big states in almost all of the small states. Who is going to be in the lead here? Well, candidate B is going to be piling up more electoral votes by winning lots of small states, because those small states get more electoral votes than we might think their population would entitle them to. And so it is to your advantage to win large numbers of small states. Also, let's assume that candidate A wins his few big states by huge margins. Let's say something like 90% to 10%. So candidate A may poll really well in New York and California, really big states, and win those, running away. Well, candidate A is probably going to have a huge advantage in the popular vote over candidate B. But it doesn't matter what the margin of victory is in a state. If you win it by a little bit or by a lot, you're not going to get any more electoral votes. It doesn't matter if you win by a small margin or a huge margin. So, that 80% margin of victory could have been a 0.8%, and it wouldn't have changed the electoral vote count. And so what's happening here, candidate A, is piling up huge amounts of popular votes in a few states. Candidate B is going out and winning a bunch of little states, maybe by razor-thin margins. We don't know. But candidate B is piling up the electoral votes, even though fewer people, as you count them, are voting for candidate B. But candidate A has all of their support located in just a few big states. And so the way the system works, they're not rewarded for that. So the number of popular votes A receives about 50% of the vote in one of those big states, and once they've achieved victory, any additional votes above that in the popular vote's not going to help them because it's not going to translate into electoral votes. And so in a sense, that support's kind of wasted because they'd have been better off if they had those supporters living in some of these other states. So for example, A could have an advantage of millions of votes nationwide, but if he doesn't win enough states, then his electoral votes will come up short. So he could have a huge margin of victory in the popular vote, but if his support isn't spread around into these different states, it's just piled up in a few states, what's going to happen is he'll won the popular vote and lost the electoral college. And so a candidate can lose that popular vote nationwide, but still win enough states that your electoral votes will lead you to victory, because the electoral votes are the ones that count. You don't win the presidency by attracting more people to vote for you, but you have to win the electoral votes, which means you have to have your support in the right states so that you win enough states in order to win the electoral college. So the candidate who won the popular vote has lost the electoral college a few times in our history. It doesn't happen terribly often. Usually the electoral college is a really good mirror of the popular vote, but it does happen once in a while. And we already mentioned Bush versus Gore back in 2000. Some of you are probably too young to remember that, which makes me feel really old, but anyway, that was a very, very close contest. And what happened there is Gore piled up lots of votes in big states like California and New York. Bush won most of the rural states and won a few big states like Florida and Ohio by very narrow margins. And when I say narrow, I mean narrow. In Florida, it was 500 votes or so out of millions cast. So a razor-thin margin of victory. So more people ended up casting votes for Gore than Bush. But his voters were concentrated in the big cities on the coasts. And so what ended up happening was he had piled up his support in just a few places, and Bush had spread his support across a larger part of the country. So Bush was able to win more states and pile up more electoral votes, and thus he won the election. And that's how it works. You have to win the electoral votes. It doesn't matter if you win a bunch more popular votes. You have to have support from enough people in enough different states in order to win in the electoral college. The time it had happened before that was 1876, and Rutherford Hayes won more small states and ended up winning more electoral votes as well than Samuel Tilden. Tilden ended up winning about 250,000 more popular votes, but Hayes won the election. And actually, people kind of thought, well, maybe the system worked like it should have, because Tilden's support was kind of concentrated in the South and one region of the country, and Hayes had support all over the country. And so that kind of rewarded that candidate that had the nationwide appeal, and kind of like it did in 2000 a little bit. Gore had all his support piled up in a few big states, and Bush had his support all across the country, and it kind of rewarded that. That's just how the system works. So I'm not going to lie to you. The Electoral College is a goofy and complicated system. It just is a little bit different. It's kind of makes you scratch your head a little bit. That's okay. It's hard to explain. Trust me on that. I've tried to explain it to classes many times over the years. It's hard to understand a little bit. Kind of outside of our normal experience, and it kind of bothers us a little bit. It seems to distort the will of the people as expressed in the popular vote, and in a sense, it kind of does. So the question is, why do we have it? Why do we keep it around? Now, we know why the Founding Fathers did it. They thought that people were too uneducated and ignorant, didn't keep up with current affairs enough, that we couldn't trust them, so we would pick electors. But now, we don't really follow that, because the electors we pick are solely determined by the popular vote. We don't depend on picking wise people to vote for president on our behalf. Well, despite its weirdness and the fact that it's changed over the years, there are some good arguments for keeping this pretty unique system in place, and we're going to look at some of those. First off, it helps to give winners legitimacy. And the reason I say that is most candidates end up winning in the Electoral College by a wide margin, even if the difference in the popular vote is small. And that's just kind of a quirk of the system. So the candidate may squeak by with 2% more of the popular vote than the other guy, but end up with 70% of the electoral votes. And so it just kind of magnifies the margin of victory sometimes. And so winning by a large margin in the Electoral College kind of tends to wrap that victor in legitimacy. People, won't scoff at you. Oh, you only won by 2%. You'll look at the Electoral College margin of victory and say, oh, they kind of blew the other candidate out of the water. And so it kind of does help with that a little bit. The more important reason, I would argue, is that it forces candidates to get out and compete all over the country. It can't just concentrate on a few states and a few big cities where most of the people live, because you have to worry about collecting electoral votes from states all over the country. And so that forces candidates to get out and campaign in lots of places, including kind of out-of-the-way places such as Missouri. And Ohio is a big battleground, kind of what the people on the coast kind of sneer at and call flyover country. It really forces these candidates to get out into the heartland, trying to get all these electoral votes rounded up. Also, it gives small states a larger voice than they would otherwise have. So candidates will spend a good amount of time courting these voters in smaller states a lot of the time, because they kind of are worth more pound for pound than a large state because of the electoral vote advantage that they have. And so that gets people to go campaign in places they might overlook otherwise. If the winner of the election was solely determined by the popular vote, then candidates would probably ignore a lot of smaller states and rural areas that they campaign in now. And certainly we want them to appeal to a broad section of the country and not just focus on a few areas. So a candidate has to attract that widespread support in order to win. And in 1888, we saw a situation where Harrison lost the popular vote but defeated Grover Cleveland. And a similar situation there where the candidate who was appealing to the entire country ended up winning the election rather than one that was kind of had their support concentrated in one area. So the Electoral College system kind of worked. It rewarded the candidate who had support all across the country. And you can see the advantage of that, why we would want to reward candidates who can attract supporters from everywhere rather than just have all their support built up in one or two areas. Also, the Electoral College tends to isolate any problems with the election to the state where it occurred, and that can be a huge advantage. Let's go back to 2000 now. And as we mentioned, that race was so tight in Florida, it ended up being decided by about 500 votes out of several million cast. It was so close that there were recounts and recounts of the recounts and everything, and that dragged on for several weeks. And it was, I relived through that. It was kind of exasperating seeing them trying to count these ballots and figure out who won that election. So it was just a mess. It was a dumpster fire trying to figure out who won the race in Florida. But we were really lucky because in most other states, the vote wasn't that close. I mean, it was close in some states, but not 500 votes close. And so the winner was more obvious in these other states. So, Florida was a dumpster fire. They were trying to figure out who won Florida. But can you imagine if we had dumped all the votes into one great big pot from coast to coast? And then we had a situation where the margin of victory was so razor thin, like Florida, and we had to have a recount of the entire country. It would have been a disaster. Trying to recount all those votes from coast to coast out of tens and tens of millions that were cast. It would have just been awful. So if the winner was determined solely by who got the most popular votes nationwide, and the race was tight enough to demand a recount, that would be a nationwide recount. And so it would have been a mess. So we had problems in Florida in 2000. It was kind of embarrassing. It was stupid. But at least those problems were contained to one state. And because of the Electoral College system, we have really 50 state races rather than one great big nationwide race. And so if there's a problem in one of those states, that's going to be limited to that state. And, so that kind of puts a firewall between the different states. If we have some problem with the voting, it's going to be limited to that state. And so that actually can be a big advantage, as Florida illustrated for us back in 2000. So there's a big question here. Does my vote count? And lots of people, when they hear about the Electoral College, lots of students over the years that I've taught, they immediately think they're being bamboozled and swindled, and then when they vote for a president, their vote doesn't count. It's just, some shady backroom thing. These guys called electors come in and choose the president for you, and your vote doesn't matter. And so they get upset about that. They think, oh, I'm not really voting for the candidate, so my vote doesn't count. Let me tell you, that is wrong. Your vote does count. I can't emphasize that enough. So don't feel that way. Your vote doesn't count in the way you maybe thought it did, but it does count. It makes a huge difference. Even though electoral votes are the ones that determine the outcome, we, the people, get to choose who the electors will be. And that's just an automatic system. That solely reflects the popular vote in each state. So your vote determines which candidate is going to win that state. It just kind of goes through this little filter we call the Electoral College, but your vote does determine the outcome. When we vote for a candidate, quote unquote, we're really just voting for that candidate's electors. So it's really not that much different, to be honest with you. So it goes through this system, but our vote certainly does count. There's a middleman in the way, but our votes still end up determining which candidate wins the election. Just goes through a little bit of a different process. And without our vote, the other candidate's slate of electors might be chosen, and they will vote for him. And so in a sense, our vote might make more of a difference in the election than if we just put all the popular votes in one basket, because, and like in the Florida situation where there's 500 votes separating, victory from defeat in the Electoral College, which is what happened back then. If Gore had 500 more people come vote for him, we'd had President Gore instead. So certainly your vote does count. And as we said, that Florida mess in 2000, that's really the best illustration. All over the country, the vote was close, but it came down to Florida, and whichever candidate was going to receive Florida's electoral votes would have more than 270 and would end up winning the election. As it turned out, 500 votes from 500 people separated the two candidates in Florida. So if we'd had 500 more people go to the polls and vote for Gore, Al Gore would have been our president for at least 4 years. We wouldn't have had George W. Bush. Who knows how history would be different. History hinged on what these 500 people did. And out of 300 million who live in the United States, 500 votes changed the destiny of our country. So the popular vote does have a huge effect. The votes of people like us do matter. They get plugged into this weird formula that we call the Electoral College, but they do matter. So please don't think that it doesn't. The Electoral College, though, does change how candidates campaign, how they try to fight for votes. We've already seen it forces them to compete in smaller and rural states, which they might otherwise kind of ignore. Also, it forces them to allocate their resources to particular states where the race is close enough to actually be competitive. What I mean by that is that in every election, there are always going to be, quote-unquote, safe Democratic states and safe Republican states. Some states just have a lot more Democrats living there than Republicans, and other states have a lot more Republicans than Democrats, and so going into the presidential election, it's really, there's no drama. We know who those states are going to vote for. Unless something, really weird happens, there's going to be some states that are so dyed-in-the-wool Democrat and some that are so dyed-in-the-wool Republican, they're just going to vote for whoever that party nominates. They just will. And if you look at the polls in those states, it becomes clear that the candidates from the other party, is just too far behind to really have a hope of winning. And so, because, the popular vote isn't the one that matters, it's the race in every state, what happens is the candidates aren't going to waste time campaigning in a state that they can't win. That would just be a waste of resources. If they're 30 points behind in a state, they're not going to waste their time trying to persuade people in that state to vote for them. Instead, they will focus on what we call swing states. And that's where the polls show the race is tight enough that a little bit of extra campaigning might persuade a few people and change the outcome of the race in that state. And so we'll look at, they'll probably both candidates will ignore those safe states, and they will concentrate on a few states where it's really a toss-up, that the people haven't made up their minds yet. And so in a presidential election season, we will see the candidates really, really focus on those states where they feel they have a real chance of victory, where they haven't locked up victory yet, but where with a little more campaigning, a little more fighting for votes, they might actually get those people to vote for them. So, kind of wrapping things up, the Electoral College process, honestly, is probably the single most confusing and difficult thing we study in this class. So, if you're still scratching your head a little bit, that's okay. Please don't neglect the textbook. I require you to read the textbook for a reason. It's there to reinforce what I tell you. Maybe it's a little clearer when I'm confusing to you. So please do use that as a resource. That's what it's there for. Also, I'd like you to take a look at this website. It's kind of fun, actually. You can play around with it and look at different scenarios on how a president is elected. It's called 270 to win. We know why that is, because of the number of Electoral College votes you need to win a majority and become president. But it's a neat little site that'll show you kind of the red states and the blue states, which are Republican and Democrat safe states in the vernacular, respectively. And it'll show you kind of the different scenarios. You can click on states and flip them from Republican to Democrat and see how a candidate could win the election, see what the pathway to victory is. So I'm going to take a few moments here and kind of demonstrate that website for you, but I want you to go to it too and just kind of play around with it. If you click on a few of those states and look at it, I think you'll understand a lot better how the Electoral College process actually works. What you're looking at now is a neat little website that's called 270towin.com, and this website shows you how the Electoral College actually works. If you look at these states, as I make this video, it's late 2015, and we're getting ready for the 2016 presidential election. We've already had some primary type debates where the different candidates from the different parties, the Democrats would have a debate, the Republicans would have a debate, and we have multiple Democrats and multiple Republicans running. But we're getting ready for the big contest, which is in 2016. And so this map is going to show you what the electoral landscape looks like for the 2016 election. If you look at this map, blue stands for Democrats, red stands for Republicans, and many of these states are already colored in. That's because based upon voting trends and polls that have been done, some of these states already are pretty much leaning either Democrat or Republican. And so a lot of these states are pretty solid Democratic states, and they're blue, like Minnesota here. Some of these states are pretty solidly Republican, such as Missouri. Used to be actually a swing state, but we've trended Republican the last several elections. Texas is deep red. They're a red state. They almost always vote for a Republican candidate. And a lot of the South is also red states. These states that are not colored in are this kind of ugly tan color. Those are the ones that are kind of up in the air. They are swing states. They haven't really, hasn't been figured out yet who they're probably going to vote for. And so the Democrat and the Republican will have about equal chances of trying to win those states over. So guess where most of their effort will go in the presidential election season? They'll be focusing on these states that they can actually flip, either blue or red. Because, like Texas, if the Democratic candidate goes down there, they can campaign all year in Texas, and they're probably never going to get enough Texans convinced to vote Democrat to win that state. Likewise, a Republican candidate could go to California, which is a blue state, and campaign their little heart out, and they'll never get enough Californians convinced to vote Republican to switch that from blue to red. And so what the candidates will do is concentrate on the states where they can actually make a big difference, where it's kind of neck and neck. And a lot of these states are kind of almost 50-50 Republicans and Democrats. North Carolina, Virginia, Ohio. And so that's going to be what we call the battleground states. So they're kind of toss-up states. We don't know which way they're going to go. And so when the candidates are out campaigning, they will concentrate on those. So if we're trying to figure out how a candidate wins an election, On election night, there will be a lot of maps that look a lot like this one, and as the results come in from the different states, they'll color in the states either blue or red to signify which candidate won those states. And we can see up here on this part of the page, here we start off, the Democrats have an advantage. They've already locked up pretty much 217 electoral votes from these states, because those are big states. New York, California, the states back east, New Jersey, they have a lot of population. The Republicans have pretty much locked up 191 electoral votes. So there's 130 here in the middle that haven't been committed yet. And so they'll be fighting over those, trying to get to the magic number of 270. That's why this site's called 270 to win, because they have to get to 270 in order to win. And so using this map, you can construct some scenarios about how the candidates could end up getting there. And they'll be fighting for the voters in these states. And so let's say, the Republicans want to take Florida. It's a big prize, 29 electoral votes. So if we get the Republicans to take Florida, okay, the Republican total increased. Now there are 220. So let's say that the Republicans also take the state of Ohio, 238. And then let's say also get North Carolina. That's 250. We're awfully close. So let's throw in, let's say Colorado, 262, still very close. So let's say the Republicans can also pick up Virginia. Okay, there we go, 275. That means a Republican has been elected president. We'll assume these other states ended up voting Democrat. And so that's what the final map would look like. But we'd have a Republican president with more than 270 electoral votes. Well, let's say that one of these states changed their mind. All it would take is one, really. Let's say Florida votes Democrat instead of Republican. Ta-da! Now the Democrat has 292 electoral votes. And so you can see how a small difference in the vote can make a huge difference in who wins the election. And back in 2000, we had a situation in Florida where 500 votes decided the entire presidential election because the race was just that close. There were recounts because it was so close. But if 500 Floridians had either stayed home and not voted, or 500 more Gore supporters had shown up instead of President George W. Bush in 2000, we had had President Al Gore for at least 4 years. And so just a handful of votes can make a huge difference. And so even though we put all these electoral votes into this weird thing called the Electoral College, please don't think that your vote doesn't count. It counts a huge amount. Just a small difference in one of these states can make a huge difference in the outcome. If we flip one state, that's all it takes to change the outcome of the election. And we've seen historically that just a few votes can change one state. But now you can see, though, we're really looking not at one huge national race, but at 50 little state races. And so the battle for each of these states is really what determines the outcome. And so, it doesn't really matter if a candidate wins by 0.1% in one of these states or by 50% in one of these states. The outcome's the same. We're just going to, that's why the popular vote and the Electoral College vote don't always match up. But the Electoral College vote does mirror the popular vote. It just kind of puts those popular vote numbers into this weird formula and comes out with something called the electoral votes. So I really encourage you to play with this website. I think it would help you understand kind of how things work just by changing states from one to another, how you can change the outcome. You can see how the strategy would differ, from having just a popular vote, and how, since we're trying to win these individual states, that changes what candidates do based upon whether they're a toss-up or not, and whether they're a swing state. And so please go and do that. It is a complicated concept, I realize, but I think playing around with this website, which is kind of a fun thing to do, to be honest with you, and it can really help you understand how the Electoral College works. So that's it for now. Thanks very much for your attention, and if you have any questions, let me know. It is a confusing topic, but thank you for bearing with me, and I'll talk to you next time.